As the country waves eagerly goodbye to 2020, we take a look back at the biggest stories of the year. It is rare that one story dwarfs and influences everything in the global news cycle, but this was not a normal year. COVID-19, which first emerged in Wuhan, China in December 2019, was initially brushed off as a mysterious but controllable flu. But within the span of 2 months, it transformed into the most devastating social and economic event in recent human history. Officially declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization in early March, broadly, here is COVID by the numbers. As at December 30th, there are 82 million cases worldwide and 1.79 million deaths. Hearteningly, about half have recovered. It placed 4 billion people, half the world's population, under some form of lockdown as governments scrambled to protect its people and flatten the curve. Masks, social distancing, wash your hands, work from home, all became buzzwords. Toilet paper became a symbol of panic buying in a crisis. In Malaysia on March 18th, new PM Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin announced the implementation of the Movement Control Order, which brought daily life to a grinding halt. Frontliners from doctors to delivery boys became heroes. Health DG Tan Sri Dr. Nur Hisham Abdullah became the face of the country's fight, a constant, calming presence with his daily COVID updates. Although necessary, subsequent iterations of the movement curbs meant that the economic damage was devastating. Second quarter GDP contracted by 17.1% as unemployment reached a high of 5.3% in May. So the government, like many around the world, started rolling out stimulus packages in order to revive the economy. In total, Malaysia has launched 305 billion ringgit in such packages covering businesses, healthcare and the rakyat. The first announced on February 27 by then PM Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad totaled 20 billion ringgit. Muhyiddin then unveiled Prihatin, a whopping 230 billion, where the government's direct spending was 25 billion, while public and private institutions bore the brunt of 225 billion. The most significant measure to come out of it was the 6-month loan moratorium. This was followed throughout the year by 3 smaller stimulus packages, Prihatin Plus, Penjana and Kita Prihatin. On the monetary policy side, in March, Bank Negara announced a 100 basis point cut in the statutory reserve requirement, releasing 30 billion into the financial system. The central bank then brought down the overnight policy rate from 3% at the start of 2020 to 1.75%, the lowest level in its history. Although the economic impact is still being tallied, the human damage is already leaving scars as people come face to face with mental health issues brought on by isolation, loss of loved ones, and possible loss of livelihood. Meanwhile, however, the outbreak shows no sign of slowing down. As at December 30th, Malaysia has 110,485 cases, 463 deaths, and 87,460 recoveries. The good news is that 2020 ends with hope in the form of not one but multiple vaccines. So far, 1.6 million people in 4 countries have been inoculated, signalling the start of the biggest vaccination campaign in history. Putrajaya has promised to buy enough to cover 80% of the Malaysian population, with the first batch due to arrive in February. In early February, as the rest of the world was beginning to get to grips with the coronavirus, Malaysians were faced with a homegrown political crisis, its own house of cards. After just 22 months, the Pakatan Harapan government fell after one fateful rainy weekend, no thanks to the Sheraton move led by Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin and Datuk Sri Azmin Ali. Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad then submitted his resignation, bringing an end to the coalition's reign. Over the course of a week, a flurry of conflicting reports and political horse trading followed, with several coalition blocs claiming to have the numbers. All eyes were on the Yang di-Pertuan Agong for direction as to who exactly had the confidence of majority in Dewan Rakyat. In the end, it was Muhyiddin who emerged as the country's 8th Prime Minister, head of the Perikatan Nasional Coalition. But the political turmoil did not end with his appointment, cascading down to the states, with the PH administrations in Johor, Malacca, Perak and Kedah collapsing as assemblymen switched to PN. In Parliament, ex-EC Chairman Dato' Azhar Azizan Harun was made Dewan Rakyat Speaker. Meanwhile, a controversial Sabah state election pitted former Chief Minister Tan Sri Musa Aman against incumbent Tan Sri Shafee Apdal, with Musa emerging victorious. So 11 months on, what is the situation now? Mahathir has set up a new party called Pejuang and has launched several attempts to bring down the current administration, but with no decisive results. His arch-nemesis, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, also had a go in September, saying that he had a strong, formidable and convincing majority, but this lost traction after his meeting with the Agong in October. As for Muhyiddin, he has managed to survive the first stormy 10 months of his premiership. The failed emergency bid aside, he has more or less gained public trust with a series of stimulus packages and decisive measures to contain the coronavirus, calling himself Abah and reassuring the people in an avuncular manner. And despite the massive resistance to Budget 2021, it eventually passed all three readings. At 322.5 billion ringgit, it is the biggest in the country's history, and it is this that Muhyiddin carries with him into the new year. The courts were also kept busy despite COVID-19, with several high-profile trials coming to an end, even as others entered the dock. And none came more high-profile than that of ex-PM Datuk Sri Najib Razak. While last year Najib made history as the first Prime Minister to take the stand against criminal charges, this year he made history as the first to be convicted. On July 28, Najib was sentenced to 12 years and a 210 million ringgit fine after being found guilty in the first of several cases related to 1MDB. High Court Judge Muhammad Nazlan Muhammad Ghazali, who presided over the case, emphatically called it the worst kind of criminal breach of trust involving a Prime Minister. Najib remains free pending his appeal. Now, earlier in this year, Najib and his wife, Datin Sri Rosmah Mansor, made the headlines for a different reason. Yes, those leaked recordings released by the MACC. Rosmah was heard almost berating her husband and was even turned into a meme. She is also facing charges of her own for her role in the solar hybrid project in Sarawak. In other 1MDB related news, the Malaysian government reached a $3.9 billion settlement with Goldman Sachs over its role in the scandal. As for other notable cases this year, former FT Minister Datuk Sri Tunku Adnan Tunku Mansor, or Kunan, is appealing his 12-month jail and 2 million ringgit fine sentence after being found guilty on a graft charge. Notably though, he was given a discharge not amounting to acquittal or a DNAA on another case involving a 1 million ringgit bribe. He is not the first to get a DNAA. There's Najib's stepson Riza Aziz, who got his $248 million money laundering case dropped after settling with the prosecution. Najib, Kunan, Riza and Najib's son, Datuk Muhammad Nasiruddin, are however still in hot water with the IRB over their tax arrears. Meanwhile, former Sabah CM Tan Sri Musa Aman was acquitted on 46 counts of corruption and money laundering after the prosecution withdrew all charges. Other cases to keep an eye on in 2021 include the graft trials of former Felda Chairman Tan Sri Muhammad Isa Samad and Lim Guan Eng in his capacity as ex-Penang CM. Ebullience returned to the stock market in the form of retail investors, adding a very much needed spark. Volumes persistently hit new highs, driven by a combination of the 6-month loan moratorium and people being bored and stuck at home. But the biggest appetite was reserved for the glove makers, and that is putting it mildly. In total, Malaysia's 7 rubber glove manufacturers, Top Glove Corp, Hatalega Holdings, Kosan Rubber Industries, Supermax Corp, Comfort Gloves, Care Plus Group and Rubberex Corp saw both their share prices and earnings shoot through the roof. Capital gains for the 7 players ranged from 125% all the way up to 1,400%. The pickup started in March as most of the world went into lockdown, and in a short span of time, global demand for gloves surged, skyrocketing both average selling prices and lead times. Ace market-listed CarePlus was the biggest gainer, its share price starting 2020 at 16.9 cent and ending on December 31st at 2 ringgit and 7 cent. But the main focus for both investors and research houses remained on the Big Four, namely Hatalega, Supermax, Kosan, and of course, the world's largest glove maker, Top Glove. Of the 4, Supermax performed the best stock price-wise. It closed January 2nd at 67.5 cent and ended December 31st at 6 ringgit 1 cent, an improvement of over 780%. It eventually became an FBM KLCI component stock. But arguably, the poster child for this segment and all its trials and tribulations is Top Glove and Chief and Founder Tan Sri Lim Wee Chai. Year to date, Top Glove's share price has gained more than 300%, starting 2020 at RM1.49 and ending December 31st at RM6.12. It chalked up its highest ever net profit of 2.38 billion ringgit for its first quarter of FY21, and Lim has seen his personal worth more than quadruple to over $4 billion. The frenzy was such that Affin Hwang Cap said in July that Top Glove's share price could surpass 110 ringgit. There was even talk of the group possibly surpassing Maybank's market cap, and it did come tantalizingly close, the gap narrowing to about 8 billion from 86 billion the same time last year. But when the fourth quarter of the year rolled around, things started to look shaky for the newly minted darlings of the stock market, especially when the vaccine became more of a reality. Top Glove, for one, found its workers becoming the country's biggest cluster, with more than 5,000 of its employees testing positive. Even so, analysts still remain upbeat on the sector as a whole, as an acute shortage remains, and with glove makers pointing out that capacity is fully taken until the first quarter of 2021. And just as telling, reminiscent of the early 2000s oil and gas boom, a number of non-glove companies such as property player Ma Seng will now be going into gloves. The question on the minds of many investors now is, as the global vaccination program begins, how long will the party last? COVID-19 made new billionaires. It also decimated several industries, jeopardizing hundreds of thousands of jobs and changing the landscape of these sectors drastically. And none was worse hit than the aviation industry. Christened the worst year in aviation history by the International Air Transport Association, COVID and COVID-linked lockdowns bankrupted several airlines, including Virgin Australia and Britain's Flybe. The survivors are only hanging on thanks to layoffs and debt restructuring, and in some instances, government support. Locally, Malaysia Airlines, AirAsia Group and its long-haul sister AirAsia X and Malindo Airways grounded its fleet during the MCO and cut thousands of staff. For AirAsia and its founders Tan Sri Tony Fernandez and Datuk Kamarudin Maranon, their year already started rocky when both men had to take a step back from the airline they founded in relation to the massive Airbus bribery scandal. Although cleared of the allegations, the two men returned only to have to face the devastation brought by COVID. MHB was also not spared, plunging into a 431 million ringgit net loss for the first 9 months of FY20, compared with $500 million in net profit for the year before. At the moment, outlook for aviation remains dim as long as the borders remain closed for the foreseeable future. The one bright spark is that domestic travel is expected to slowly recover. It was the same story for a closely linked industry, tourism. This was supposed to be Visit Malaysia Year 2020 after all. And now tourism receipts have plunged 81% to 12.6 billion, with the hotel industry expected to lose as much as 6.54 billion ringgit in revenue this year. Since March, 109 hotels, resorts, motels, homestays and chalets have shut for good, and amusement parks have become ghost towns. The government has since launched the National Tourism Policy to help the sector get back on its feet. And finally, retail, a sector that employs 1.55 million people, has had the most mixed of fortunes. Retail sales are expected to contract around 16% this year, which is bad, but not worse than during the Asian financial crisis. But more painful have been the numerous shop closures, the biggest of which was Robinson's, with more expected in the new year. However, there has been a distinct shift to online shopping, forcing retailers to face their shortcomings in their online presence. Now, although some feel that retail will recover in 2021, just as many feel that it won't be that easy. But all agree that the biggest change retail will see is better integration with technology. And if there is one thing that COVID-19 has taught its players, is that omni-channel retailing is the only way to go.